Hollywood had a problem with Bruce Lee. Not because he was talented, not because he was charismatic, and certainly not because he couldn't fight. The problem was that Hollywood didn't know where to put him. In an industry built around familiar faces and familiar stereotypes, Bruce Lee arrived with something different. He was Asian. He was outspoken. He was fiercely independent. And he refused to accept the idea that an Asian actor had to remain on the sidelines. At a time when Asian characters in American movies were often reduced to stereotypes, Bruce Lee wanted something more. He wanted to be the hero. He wanted to tell his own story. And he wanted audiences around the world to see Asian strength, intelligence, discipline, and humanity through a completely different lens. But Bruce Lee was simply trying to become famous. He was fighting a much bigger battle. A battle against the limits other people had placed on him. When Hollywood closed one door, he found another way in. When producers told him what an Asian star was supposed to look like, he challenged the entire idea. And when the industry refused to give him the opportunity he believed he deserved, Bruce Lee went somewhere else and created his own. Then came the Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Way of the Dragon, and finally, Enter the Dragon. In just a few years, a young man from Hong Kong became an international phenomenon. But his greatest achievement was becoming a martial arts icon. It was changing what audiences believed an Asian movie star could be. Decades later, actors, filmmakers, and martial artists would continue following the path he helped create. And Hollywood itself would slowly begin to change. Bruce Lee never lived long enough to see the full impact of what he had started. But perhaps that's what makes his story so extraordinary. Because Bruce Lee didn't wait for Hollywood to change. He changed it first. Long before the world knew him as Bruce Lee. He was simply a boy growing up in Hong Kong. But even then, there was something different about him. Bruce Lee was born in San Francisco in 1940, while his parents were temporarily in the United States. But he grew up primarily in Hong Kong, surrounded by a world where Chinese culture, traditional values, cinema, and martial arts were deeply woven into everyday life. His father, Lee Hoi-Chuen, was a well-known Cantonese opera performer. And because of his father's career, Bruce was introduced to the world of entertainment at an incredibly young age. He appeared in films as a child. He stood in front of cameras before most children even understood what acting meant. But acting alone wasn't enough. Bruce was restless. He was energetic, sometimes difficult to control. And according to accounts of his youth, he frequently found himself involved in fights. For Bruce, fighting wasn't simply about proving that he was stronger. It became a way of understanding himself. Eventually, he began studying Wing Chun under the legendary martial artist Ip Man. This was a turning point. Wing Chun wasn't simply about brute strength. It emphasized timing, precision, efficiency, economy of movement, and perhaps most importantly, their ability to adapt. Those principles would eventually become deeply connected to Bruce Lee's philosophy of life. But Bruce wasn't interested in becoming just another martial artist. He wanted to understand why things worked. Why one technique succeeded while another failed. Why one person could defeat someone physically stronger. He questioned everything. And that habit of questioning would follow him for the rest of his life. As a teenager, Bruce's fighting continued to cause problems. His family became increasingly concerned about his future. Eventually, Bruce returned to the United States. He was 18 years old. And he carried something with him that would become increasingly important. A belief that his future had to be bigger than the circumstances around him. In America, Bruce faced a completely different world. He had to support himself. He had to study. He had to find his place in a society where he was often seen first as an immigrant and an Asian man before people saw his talent. But Bruce refused to disappear into the background. He enrolled at the University of Washington and studied philosophy. And this detail matters, because Bruce Lee wasn't simply training his body. He was training his mind. He began connecting philosophy with martial arts. He questioned rigid systems. He questioned tradition. And he questioned their idea that there was only one correct way to fight or to live. Eventually, he began teaching martial arts. But even here, Bruce was different. He didn't want to simply preserve one traditional system. He wanted to experiment, to test, to learn, to adapt. His approach would eventually lead toward the philosophy that became Jeet Kune. But before that philosophy became famous, Bruce Lee was still fighting another battle. The battle to be seen. Because America in the 1960s was not Hollywood as we know it today. Opportunities for Asian actors were limited. Asian characters were frequently reduced to stereotypes. And the idea of an Asian man becoming a major American action star was almost unthinkable. Bruce Lee understood that reality. But he refused to accept it as destiny. He wanted to play characters with strength, personality, humor, intelligence, and dignity. He didn't want to simply be the mysterious martial artist standing in the background. He wanted to be the person the audience came to see. That ambition would eventually bring him to television. In 1966, Bruce Lee was cast as Kato in the television series The Green Hornet. For American audiences, it was an introduction to a completely new presence. Kato wasn't simply another side character. Bruce made him memorable. His speed, his movement, his confidence, his physical presence. Suddenly, audiences were asking a different question. Not, who is this Asian actor, but, who is Bruce Lee? And that question would soon become impossible for Hollywood to ignore. But there was a problem. Bruce Lee had shown America what he could do. Hollywood still wasn't sure what to do with him. He had the talent. He had the charisma. He had the physical ability. But the industry wasn't yet ready to make him the kind of leading man he believed he could become. For another actor, that might have been the moment to give up. Bruce Lee saw it differently. If Hollywood wouldn't give him the role he wanted, perhaps he would have to create a different path himself. And that decision would eventually take him back to Hong Kong. Back to the place where his journey had begun. But this time, he wouldn't be returning as the restless young boy who once dreamed of becoming something more. He would return as a man determined to prove that the world had underestimated him. And when the cameras started rolling again, Hollywood would soon discover that Bruce Lee was not waiting for permission anymore. Bruce Lee had already proved that he could move faster than almost anyone on screen. But speed wasn't his biggest obstacle. His biggest obstacle was perception. Hollywood could see the martial artist. It could see the charisma. It could see the camera presence. But for a long time, it struggled to see Bruce Lee as something more. A leading man. A movie star. A hero. And that distinction mattered. Because Bruce Lee was trying to become famous simply for being good at martial arts. He wanted to change the role that Asian actors were allowed to play in American entertainment. After The Green Hornet, Bruce expected bigger opportunities. Instead, the offers were limited. Hollywood still had a narrow idea of what an Asian character was supposed to be. Often mysterious, sometimes comic, frequently stereotypical, but rarely the central hero. Bruce didn't hide his frustration. He understood that talent alone wasn't always enough. Sometimes the system itself decided who was allowed to become a star. And Bruce Lee wasn't willing to accept that decision. So he continued working. He taught martial arts. He trained actors. He developed his own ideas. And he kept studying the entertainment industry from the inside. At one point, he even developed ideas for television projects that would place an Asian martial artist at the center of the story. But the opportunities he wanted didn't arrive in the way he expected. Instead, another actor was eventually cast in the Western television series Kung Fu. The project became successful, but Bruce Lee was the star. For Bruce, this was another reminder of the limits he was facing. He had the ability. He had the screen presence. He had the martial arts expertise. Yet Hollywood still wasn't prepared to give him the role he believed he deserved. This could have broken him. Instead, it pushed him toward a decision that would change his life. Bruce returned to Hong Kong, and the timing could not have been better. The Hong Kong film industry was beginning to discover the power of martial arts cinema. Bruce Lee was given the opportunity to star in The Big Boss. And suddenly, everything changed. The Bruce Lee that Hollywood had struggled to understand became impossible to ignore. The Big Boss became a major success. Bruce was a supporting character. He was comic relief. He was the mysterious sidekick. He was the center of the story. The camera followed him. The audience waited for him. And when Bruce Lee fought, the screen seemed to change. His movements were incredibly fast. His physical control was extraordinary. But what made him different was simply technique. It was presence. Bruce didn't fight like someone performing a routine. He fought like someone with something to prove. Every movement carried emotion. Anger, pain, determination, defiance. Audiences could feel it. And suddenly, Bruce Lee was just a martial artist. He was a movie star. Then came Fist of Fury. The impact became even greater. Bruce played a character driven by loyalty, pride, and anger after the death of his teacher. The film transformed him into a cultural phenomenon. His image spread across Asia. Young people imitated his movements, his hairstyle, his expressions, his fighting stance. But Bruce was satisfied. He wanted control over the way his stories were told. That desire led to Way of the Dragon. For the first time, Bruce had an even greater level of creative control. He wrote, directed, produced, and starred in the film. It was more than a showcase for martial arts. It was Bruce Lee demonstrating that he could be a complete filmmaker. And then came the fight that would become one of the most famous martial arts sequences in cinema history. Bruce Lee versus Chuck Norris. Two icons, one location, and a fight that would eventually become legendary. But beneath the action was something bigger. Bruce Lee was proving that he didn't need Hollywood to define him. He could create his own vision. And audiences were ready for it. Hollywood began paying attention. The industry that had once struggled to find a place for Bruce Lee was now watching him become an international sensation. Then came the opportunity that could change everything. Enter the Dragon, a major international production, a collaboration between Hong Kong cinema and Hollywood. For Bruce Lee, this was the doorway he had been waiting for. He was finally going to introduce himself to the entire Western world on his own terms. The stakes were enormous, because Bruce was simply starring in another martial arts movie. He was carrying something much bigger. The hopes of people who had rarely seen someone who looked like them become the hero of a major international film. He was about to prove that an Asian actor could command the screen, could carry a blockbuster, could become a global icon. And for a brief moment, it seemed like nothing could stop him. But Bruce Lee had already learned one of the hardest lessons in Hollywood. The industry doesn't always give you the opportunity you deserve. Sometimes, you have to build the opportunity yourself. And Bruce Lee was about to do exactly that. But the most important part of his story was simply that he became a bigger star. It was the philosophy he developed along the way. Because Bruce Lee wasn't interested in creating another rigid system. He wanted freedom. Freedom to experiment. Freedom to adapt. Freedom to become whatever the situation demanded. And that idea would eventually become one of his greatest contributions to the world. Not just a fighting style, but a completely different way of thinking. Bruce Lee had already discovered something important. The world didn't always reward people for following their rules. Sometimes, the rules were the very thing holding them back. And Bruce Lee was becoming increasingly convinced that this was true not only in Hollywood, but in martial arts. For centuries, martial arts had been built around systems, styles, traditions, specific techniques passed from one generation to another. These traditions had value. Bruce respected what he had learned, but he refused to believe that one system could contain every answer. Because real life was a classroom, and a real fight didn't follow a script. An opponent didn't attack according to your preferred style. They didn't wait for you to prepare. They didn't give you time to choose the perfect technique. You had to react. You had to adapt. You had to survive. And that idea became central to Bruce Lee's philosophy. He wanted martial arts to become less about protecting a tradition, and more about understanding reality. This philosophy eventually became known as Jeet Kune. The name is often translated as the way of the intercepting fist. But Jeet Kune was never meant to be simply another rigid martial arts system. In many ways, it was the opposite. Bruce encouraged students to question, to experiment, to take what was useful, and discard what wasn't. He believed a martial artist shouldn't become trapped by a label. Because once you become obsessed with a style, you can forget the reason the style exists in the first place. To help you become more capable, more aware, more adaptable. This was a radical idea, and it reflected the way Bruce himself lived. He was constantly learning. He studied different martial arts. He examined Western boxing, fencing, footwork, conditioning, movement, psychology, philosophy. He wasn't afraid to borrow an idea from one discipline and combine it with another. Because to Bruce, knowledge belonged to anyone willing to search for it. That philosophy also shaped his approach to acting. Bruce understood that physical movement alone couldn't create a great screen character. The audience needed to feel something. A punch had to mean something. A scream had to mean something. Even a moment of silence could communicate emotion. That's why his performances remained so recognizable. Bruce Lee didn't simply move quickly. He expressed himself through movement. His body became another language, and his famous facial expressions became part of that language. Their intense eyes, the sudden stillness, their explosive movement, the famous battle cry. These weren't random tricks. They helped create a character that audiences could immediately recognize. But perhaps Bruce's most important lesson wasn't about fighting at all. It was about identity. He refused to accept the idea that he had to choose between being Chinese and being American, between tradition and modernity, between martial artist and actor, between student and teacher. He could be all of them. He could take different influences and create something uniquely his own. That idea became especially powerful when he began speaking publicly about his philosophy. One of his most famous metaphors compared adaptability to water. Water can flow. It can crash. It can fill a container. It can move around an obstacle. It changes shape without losing its essential nature. For Bruce Lee, this became a philosophy of life. Don't become trapped. Don't become rigid. Don't assume there is only one path. Adapt. Keep learning. Keep moving. And perhaps this is where Bruce Lee's story becomes larger than martial arts. Because the same philosophy that helped him become a better fighter helped him survive Hollywood when Hollywood told him what an Asian actor was supposed to be. He adapted. When opportunities disappeared, he found another path. When traditional martial arts seemed too restrictive, he questioned them. And when people tried to place him inside a single category, he refused. Bruce Lee was constantly becoming, and that made him difficult to define. But it also made him unforgettable. By the early 1970s, his philosophy and his physical abilities had come together into something extraordinary. He was simply a martial artist who happened to act. He was simply an actor who knew martial arts. He was becoming an entirely new kind of screen presence. And audiences were beginning to realize it. Then the Big Boss arrived. Then Fist of Fury. Then Way of the Dragon. Each film made Bruce Lee bigger. Each performance made him harder to ignore. But the greatest stage was still ahead. Enter the Dragon would introduce Bruce Lee to audiences on an unprecedented scale. And suddenly, the man Hollywood once struggled to understand was about to become the face of martial arts cinema around the world. Bruce had spent years trying to get through the door. Now, the door was finally opening. But nobody knew just how far the man behind it was about to go. For years, Bruce Lee had been told, directly and indirectly, that he was asking for too much. He wanted to be the leading man. He wanted creative control. He wanted Asian characters to have dignity. He wanted audiences to see something they had rarely seen before. And now, he finally had his opportunity. Enter the Dragon. The film was a collaboration between Hong Kong filmmaking and Hollywood, and it gave Bruce Lee the international platform he had been waiting for. But Bruce understood the pressure. This was simply another movie. For him, it was a chance to prove that the world had been wrong about what an Asian actor could become. The production brought together martial arts, espionage, action, and Hollywood spectacle. And at the center of it all was Bruce Lee. His character was calm, disciplined, intelligent, dangerous when necessary. But perhaps most importantly, he was never portrayed as a joke. Bruce Lee's presence carried the film. His movements were unlike anything many Western audiences had ever witnessed. The speed, the precision, the control, the intensity. Every movement seemed to contain an explosion waiting to happen. But Bruce knew that spectacular fighting alone wasn't enough. The audience had to care about the person behind the fighting. That was one of the reasons his screen presence was so powerful. He could stand completely still, and still command attention. Then, in an instant, he could explode into motion. That contrast became part of his identity. Bruce Lee's influence began spreading far beyond Hong Kong. Audiences in the United States and around the world were discovering him. And something unexpected happened. People weren't simply watching Bruce Lee. They were imitating him. Martial arts schools began attracting new students. Young people became fascinated by Asian martial arts. His movements became part of popular culture. His image appeared on posters, magazines, television, and merchandise. Bruce Lee had become a global icon. But there was something deeper happening. For Asian audiences, his success carried a special meaning. Here was an Asian man standing at the center of a major international production. Not as a stereotype, not as a side character, not as someone waiting for the Western hero to save the day. He was the hero, and he commanded the screen. That representation mattered. It challenged an old assumption about who could become a global movie star. Bruce Lee had spent years trying to break through a barrier that many people couldn't even see. Now, millions of people could see exactly what he had been fighting for. But perhaps the most remarkable part was how quickly everything happened. Bruce Lee's international fame was still relatively young. He had not spent decades building his global reputation. He was only beginning to reach the level of worldwide recognition that other stars had spent years developing. And yet, his impact was enormous. His career seemed to be accelerating at extraordinary speed. There were more projects ahead, more stories to tell, more ideas he wanted to explore. Bruce was not thinking about their end. He was thinking about what came next. And that makes what happened afterward so difficult to understand. Because in 1973, Bruce Lee died at the age of 32. His death shocked the world. A career that had seemed to be moving toward something even greater suddenly stopped. There would be no decades of new films, no long transition into old age, no chance to see what kind of filmmaker he might have become, no opportunity to discover how far his philosophy could have developed. The world was left with unfinished possibilities. But something strange happened after his death. Bruce Lee didn't disappear. He became larger. His films continued reaching new audiences. His books continued being read. His philosophy continued being discussed. And the people he inspired began carrying his ideas into the future. Actors, martial artists, athletes, filmmakers, people who had never even met him. His influence crossed borders that his short life never could. And perhaps that is one of the most powerful paradoxes of Bruce Lee's story. His physical life was incredibly short, but his cultural life became almost impossible to measure. He had spent years trying to convince Hollywood to see him differently. In the end, he changed the way Hollywood saw people like him. He had wanted to become a movie star. He became something bigger. A symbol, a philosophy, an image of determination that could be understood even without translation. And the story could have ended there. A young martial artist, a handful of legendary films, a tragic death. But Bruce Lee's greatest impact was still waiting to be measured. Because the people who came after him would take the door he had pushed open and walk through it. They would build careers using possibilities that had barely existed before him. And they would prove that Bruce Lee's greatest fight was never simply about winning on screen. It was about changing the rules of who was allowed to stand at the center of it. And that legacy would continue long after the dragon was gone. Bruce Lee never got to see the full impact of his own success. He never saw how far his influence would travel. He never saw the generations of actors who would follow. He never saw martial arts become a global part of popular culture in the way it is today. And he never saw Hollywood slowly begin to understand something he had been trying to prove. An Asian actor could be the hero, could command the screen, could become a global superstar. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Bruce Lee's legacy is that it didn't end with his films. It expanded. After his death, his movies continued reaching new audiences. People who weren't even born when Bruce Lee was alive discovered Enter the Dragon. Then they discovered Fist of Fury. Then Way of the Dragon. And with every new generation, the legend grew. Bruce Lee became more than an actor, more than a martial artist, more than a celebrity. He became an idea. The idea that limitations don't always have to be accepted. That tradition can be respected without becoming imprisoned by it. That strength isn't simply physical, and that the greatest opponent you may ever face can sometimes be the version of yourself that believes you cannot go any further. His philosophy reached people far beyond martial arts. Athletes studied his discipline. Actors admired his screen presence. Filmmakers borrowed from his visual style. Martial artists around the world studied his movements. And young people who knew nothing about martial arts discovered his philosophy through books, interviews, documentaries, and quotes. His famous image became instantly recognizable. The yellow tracksuit, the intense expression, the lightning-fast movements. the famous battle cry. But beneath the image was a man who spent much of his life thinking, questioning, learning, and refusing to accept simple answers. That may be why his legacy has lasted so long. Bruce Lee was telling people to become Bruce Lee. He was telling them to discover who they could become. And that message has no expiration date. His influence can also be seen in the generations of Asian and Asian American performers who followed. The entertainment industry did not transform overnight. There were still barriers, still stereotypes, still unequal opportunities. But the possibility had changed. Audiences had already seen Bruce Lee. They had already responded to him. They had already made him a global star. And once an audience proves that it wants something, it becomes harder for an industry to pretend that it doesn't exist. Bruce Lee helped demonstrate that martial arts cinema could cross cultural boundaries. A story created in Hong Kong could become a global phenomenon. A performer who did not fit Hollywood's traditional image could become one of the most recognizable faces in the world. That was revolutionary. And perhaps his greatest victory was not becoming accepted by Hollywood. It was proving that he didn't need Hollywood's approval to become important. He created his own identity. He created his own philosophy. He created his own path. And eventually, the world followed. There is also something deeply human about Bruce Lee's story. He was not born knowing exactly who he would become. He struggled. He faced rejection. He questioned himself. He changed direction. He worked. He learned. He failed. And he kept moving. That's why his story continues to resonate. Because underneath the legend, there was a person. A young man who once dreamed of becoming something more. A man who entered an unfamiliar country. A performer who faced an industry that didn't know where to place him. A martial artist who challenged traditional thinking. And an artist who refused to remain inside someone else's definition of what he could be. His life was tragically short. But perhaps the length of a life isn't the only way to measure its impact. Some people live for 80 years and leave behind memories. Others live for 32 and leave behind a movement. Bruce Lee belongs to the second category. He didn't have time to finish everything he wanted to accomplish. But maybe that unfinished quality is part of what makes his story so powerful. There were more movies he could have made, more ideas he could have explored, more philosophies he could have developed, more doors he could have opened. We will never know exactly what Bruce Lee would have become. And perhaps we shouldn't try to invent an answer. Because what he actually accomplished is already extraordinary. He entered Hollywood when the doors were barely open. He faced stereotypes without allowing them to define him. He created a new philosophy of martial arts. He became an international movie star. And he left behind an influence that continues decades after his death. Bruce Lee once fought to be seen. Now, he is impossible to forget. The boy who refused to be ordinary became the man who refused to accept limits. The actor Hollywood struggled to understand became a symbol of global cinema. The martial artist who questioned every rule inspired generations to question their own. And the man whose life ended far too soon became a legend whose story never really ended. Because legends don't survive simply because people remember their names. They survive because their ideas continue moving. And Bruce Lee's ideas are still moving, still inspiring, still challenging, still breaking boundaries. Perhaps that is the final truth about Bruce Lee. He didn't change Hollywood because Hollywood decided to change for him. He changed Hollywood because he refused to wait. He created his own path. And eventually, the world had no choice but to notice. Bruce Lee never lived long enough to see the world he helped create. But he didn't need to. Because every time an audience watches an Asian actor take center stage, every time a martial artist pushes beyond tradition, every time someone chooses to adapt instead of surrender, a small part of Bruce Lee's legacy lives again. He may have left the screen decades ago, but the dragon never truly disappeared. He simply became immortal in a different way.